Now's the time.
Welcome. Control energy. Dispose of a haunted item.
Nope, you're the first person I told because I don't want people to think I'm crazy. But
Right.
Since 2017, everything appears the same. But since 2017, everything has changed. Everything has changed. Everything has changed. They're shaking off the stigma. The cat is out the bag. They're facing up the enigma. They're burning down the flag. They're opening up the X-Files. 'Cause lies are such a drag. Tom DeLonge didn't sleep 3 nights. And you understand when you realize what's going down and the ramifications, the fallen nations and the permutations. Great expectations.
It's rotating. My gosh. They're all going against the wind. Look at that thing, dude.
Since 2017, fruit bat reset and another war of the damned and deranged. But since 2017, everything has changed. Everything has changed. Everything has changed. They're telling you you're not crazy if you saw lights in the sky. And if your memory is hazy, it doesn't mean you were high. They may even praise you for saying what you saw. Leslie Kane and James Fox opening up Pandora's box. We're going down. Some television, scientific derision, the big collision, the fall of religion, like a human vision, like a human vision, yeah. Like a human
And then he called back 5 minutes later. This time he was very frightened, very scared, shouting into the phone, saying that he saw...
They come to take the matches from the child.
And they were seeing a oval-shaped orange-red object hovering.
They come to take the matches from the child.
And he was frightened. He wanted me to
Come to calm us down.
tell him what to do.
Because things have been getting pretty wild.
What should he do?
To help us understand that we're part of something grand and much bigger.
And as I was speaking to him, the missiles went into inoperable condition, what we called no-go. And we lost all 10 of them.
They come to take the matches from the child.
Actually, I think they're here to help us evolve into better conditions, human conditions. Human conditions.
They've come to calm us down because things have been getting pretty wild. To help us understand that we're part of something grand and much bigger.
They're the enemy, obviously, but I don't think they are the enemy. I don't think.
They've come to take the matches from the child.
Actually, I think they're here to help us evolve into better conditions, human conditions.
Okay. I'm very honored and thrilled to have my guest here tonight. If you've ever seen me at an event, if you've ever gone on a ghost hunt with me, one of the things that I love to do at the beginning of it, because I'm an 80s junkie, I always say, all right, everybody, let's have fun tonight. And the responsorial is, everybody
Wang Chung tonight.
And it's become a mantra for me. Mr. Hues, Jack, I'm so honored to have you here tonight. But as Walt Whitman once wrote, I contain multitudes, and so do you. So do we. We all have different facets of ourselves. So while we will get into a little bit of the music end, there's a side of yourself that you're exploring more publicly these days that gives us some common ground. And can you tell me a little bit about your interest in ufology?
Yes. It's an interest I've had since, I guess, around about, since I moved out of London, really, I suppose, which was way back in, where are we, sort of 1995, 6, something like that. And moving down here to Canterbury, I met some people who were interested in, I guess you could call it alternative histories, you know. And up until that point, this is something I'd never really come across at all. I went to a talk by a guy called Richard Hoagland, actually, who at that time was promoting a book about the face on Mars. And, you know, I was then fairly skeptical, probably remain rather skeptical about that particular subject. But the room was full of people who had all sorts of interesting theories and ideas. And afterwards, I was speaking to some of them. And I sort of realized there was this whole world of, let's call it alternative histories, that I knew nothing about. And I started researching it. They gave me some book tips. I think the first book was about the Philadelphia experiment, and I can't remember who wrote that now, but it's the standard text on that, you know. And as always with these books, when somebody can tell you about something and you think, sounds kind of weird, you know, but when you read the book and you start getting in down the rabbit hole with it, you know, then it becomes more interesting. And from that, that naturally led on to the sort of UFO subject. And in those days, the books by Timothy Good were sort of readily available and were the kind of go-to books. So there's a book he wrote called Above Top Secret. And that's a pretty kind of sober documentary look at the subject. You know, cites all the major events from Kenneth Arnold's sighting of the saucers. You know, up through, I guess, to sort of the 1980s, I suppose. You know. And from there, I started just devouring UFO books, you know, and yeah, so just found the subject fascinating, you know, and I guess one of the most fascinating things is that, I mean, it's getting better now, but for years and years, it was a sort of taboo subject, you know. If you brought it up with people who were not in any way familiar with it, they were immediately pretty derisive about the subject, as opposed to just like open. Do you know what I mean? And I sort of realized that, you know, there is a lot of subtle programming that goes on around all sorts of matters, actually, you know, but particularly that subject.
This is very true. And myself personally, I've been getting more into ufology these days through my connection with the show Paranormal Caught on Camera.
Right.
And when I have to prepare for the show, I have a lot of UFO sighting videos or weird look up in the sky videos that I have to comment on. So it's forced me to do deep dives, and I'm continually fascinated about what I find. And I find myself flabbergasted by some of the theories that I can't prove. You can't point to anything solid, but somewhere inside you go, this is making sense.
Yeah. Certain
Is there
things
any one of those for you that you're like, oh yeah, I read this. I can't prove it to you, but it makes sense to me.
I mean, to sort of give a little bit of my own history in the experiencing the subject, you know, which are, you know, so I was on holiday with my kids. So this is back in the 80s sometime, I think, before I was at all interested in the subject. And we'd been out with my, to sort of dinner at a sort of pub. So my kids were probably at that age, what sort of 15, 13 and 11, something like that, you know. And so we had we'd been to a pub for dinner and we'd been supermarket shopping. So my wife Mel and the younger ones were taking the shopping into the house, and me and my older son Harry, I was caught by this quite bright light in the sky and a sort of noise as well. It sounded like a kind of tractor or a helicopter maybe, you know. And of course we were staying in Suffolk in the UK, which is a very sort of flat area with lots of farmland and very few buildings and stuff. So this light was just over, you know, on the tree line kind of thing, you know. And as we were looking at it, it suddenly shot across the sky and was sort of over there kind of thing, you know, still glimmering. And it kept moving back and forth. And this noise didn't follow the light. It was just a constant sort of noise. It was quite a strange phenomena. And after a while, it sort of shot off. It's like 45 degrees up into the sky, like in the blink of an eye, you know. And we both sort of looked at each other and thought that was kind of weird, but didn't really talk about it. And at that time, I had no context for sort of explaining it. And it was only later when I started getting into the subject that I thought, I guess that's a fairly classic UFO sighting. And in Suffolk, they do have, especially at that time, they had the American-run military bases or Air Force bases. I think they were famously, you know, the Rendlesham Forest kind of area is up in Suffolk. And Rendlesham back in 1980 was where a supposed sort of multiple encounters took place between Christmas and New Year, which has been very deeply documented. I think there was some, because it was an American air base, but located in the UK, there was a Freedom of Information request around these sightings, which resulted in a tape being released of supposedly recorded at the time, you know. Now, with all these things, you know, maybe the takes are fake, you know, the people involved in it seem to change their stories over the years. So I think with ufology, it isn't a subject where you can go like, so Rendlesham Forest, that actually happened. You know, there's still doubt around it, even though there's huge amounts of evidence to suggest that something did happen, you know. But the same old debunking stories keep coming up every time it sort of, you know, comes up to the surface, you know. And even that I find interesting. I don't find it particularly frustrating, I think, as a lot of people do. I just find it an interesting thing, you know.
Now, back then, okay, you were very focused on your music career, and that's how people knew you. That's how I was introduced to you. And throughout the years, I've listened to the songs, and every now and then a line will pop out. Something will go, "Ooh, I wonder what that's about." And it speaks to me. The clues hidden. Paul is dead. some that we can point out just on the lists, starting way back: Akasha, more recently Space Junk, which I gotta say, that song was responsible for hooking me into The Walking Dead.
Okay.
Being part of the Greatest Hits compilation, when I heard those first few notes, I said, "Ooh,
Yeah.
the director used a Wang Chung song. I'm in."
You're right. Wonderful. Yeah. We were very fortunate that is it Frank Darabont, I think, directed the first series, I think. And he was a big fan of that song, which, as you say, appeared on a Greatest Hits album. It wasn't a sort of part of the staple catalogue. We recorded it in '97, I think. And so, yeah, again, you know, I think there's something about the way that we write that has this kind of cinematic quality to it. It's certainly atmospheric. And one of the things, you know, when we talk about more widely about the paranormal, you know, I've always felt, but over the more recent years, felt very strongly that music is one of the most common manifestations of paranormal stuff, you know, because of the level of, the kind of level of communication that you have with an audience when you're performing live, you know, but also recorded music, you know, can have a, you know, a very haunting effect on people, to use a, you know, strong word, but, you know.
Yeah. Well, there have been studies done that talk about the vibration and the way that the harmonics interact with different people, and that you might like a song, but it might not be on the right vibration. But there's some tracks that harmonize with you naturally. And I've felt this sometimes when I'm editing or working on graphics, and I'll have a track on, and it just puts me in this groove where white moments come and everything is in sync. Do you feel that music is a sort of universal language? Is there something very basic to it that permeates, that it would be so throughout the universe?
I mean, when we're talking like this idea that certain things harmonize with you personally is very much what Wang Chung means, you know, which is this, you know, I appreciate you not asking me that question, but I'll answer it anyway. You know, so it's a Chinese concept in Chinese music, I think, or it's a concept that I came across on a book about Stockhausen, the German composer, and it's to do with this. It translates literally Wang Zhong as a yellow bell, and the yellow bell rings at the center of the universe, producing thousands of frequencies, billions of frequencies, of which our reality is one. But this idea that frequency is something that you relate to or that you don't is at the heart of Wang Chung, in a sense, you know. And that's a kind of the concept that's, in a sense, grown with me over the years, you know, from what was initially a very whimsical and quite ignorant sort of choice of band name. You know, it was just amusing at the time, but over the years, it's become more kind of resonant, you know, to use another good metaphor.
I mean, I mentioned Akasha, which in it starts out, "Did I get here in a spacecraft? Did I travel in my mind?" And this is a very deep lyric. And then the song ends up with the refrain, "On Earth, I loved you so." Now, can you tell me a little bit about that track and maybe what inspired you? What were how did the lyrics come about?
It was a very sort of one-off kind of track that I did on my own, actually. Nick wasn't involved at that time. During the sort of early 2000s, we were not really working together, you know. And I think somebody had it was done for a charity record, and I had this track that I was working on, you know, Akasha. And, you know, it comes from the idea of the Akashic records, the idea that there is some sort of stash of ancient knowledge somewhere that you can access, that it may even be in some sort of spiritual form rather than in a kind of physical form, you know. So I think I was just sort of spinning off on, you know, well, you know, who are we and how did we get here, you know? And, you know, inevitably that love is this sort of connective force, you know, whether it be between a man and a woman or between people more generally. And I think the song is kind of riffing on that or over some kind of nice guitar arpeggio, as I remember it, you know.
I mean, lately more and more I've been subscribing to the theory that yes, we were planted here, we were engineered by some way through some extraterrestrial interference, be it a plan, be it an accident. And I feel like the pantheons of many of the gods of many of our ancient cultures could have very well just been a crew.
Yeah.
Do you feel that life here began out there?
Sort of yes is the simple answer to that. You know, I've read quite a few books around sort of, you know, the problems with Darwinism, basically as a theory for accounting for human origins, you know. And I'm fairly convinced, although there's evidence, and as I talk like this, I can hear some of my friends who are much more scientifically minded than I am, you know, going like, "Arr." But yeah, to me, that, you know, there's lots of evidence for adaptation. But there is, you know, there's not evidence for one species evolving into another. You know, the fossil record doesn't show evolution. It shows like some, almost as if some kind of comet packed with life kind of arrived here into lukewarm ocean and was able to sort of start replicating. And all the species were basically there from the beginning. So I think I'm sort of certainly into that idea, you know, whether it comes down to actual, you know, life here being tinkered with by identifiable other beings. I'm pretty open to that, actually. I think that's highly likely, really. You know, human beings, I sort of feel, you know, that we're not. It doesn't feel like we're a natural emanation of this planet. You know, when you look at all the other animals and creatures and stuff, they seem reasonably well adapted to their environment, but human beings are not terribly well adapted. So yes, I think there could well be, you know, outside influence, and the ideas in modern ufology that you know, that the, as it were, what they call the NHIs, the non-human intelligence, is actually not from out there, but well, not at the moment, but is actually here in the oceans, perhaps. You know, that the craft that we see actually originate from quite close in our solar system. You know, maybe the moons of Mars or something like that, and on this planet. That, you know, so all of this problem that the more scientific people have with the impossibility of the distances involved to be travelled in conventional physics, you know, they immediately disappear if you sort of think, well, these creatures have been here longer than human beings have been here. And there's a lot of, I would say, evidence to suggest that that's the case. You know?
It is very much a human conceit that everything must be for us. We are here. Everything revolves around us, the Earth-centric view. And I feel like our attitudes towards the topic evolve as pop culture, sci-fi, both books and TV and movies, introduce us these concepts. I know a lot of film snobs will downcast like the Marvel movies and things like that, but we've gotten concepts like multiverse, other dimensions, and now the average person is thinking, oh yeah, well, that makes sense. And even if they're referring a comic-inspired movie, it's opening their minds to the possibility that this three-dimensional world we're in, there's so much more. We're very tiny. We're very small.
And that, of course, is another sort of one of the theories about the nature of this NHI, this intelligence that manifests itself mainly with lights and sometimes physical craft, that it is an interdimensional phenomena that sort of flips in and out of the 3 dimensions, or 4 dimensions if you count time. But, you know, what we perceive as human beings, you know, is without doubt a very narrow band of reality, in inverted commas, you know, and we have machines that extend beyond what we can perceive just organically. But this, one imagines this, well, as Stockhausen himself, I love his lectures where he's talking about octaves of perception. So in music, you know, you have an octave. It's hard to explain, but it's, you know, you have a middle C on the piano, you go up 8 notes or 12 if you're chromatic, and you arrive at another C, and then you go up another 8 notes, another C, and that you perceive that as like the same note, basically. But in each of those octaves, he says, you know, well, that sort of reality is the same, you know, it exists in octaves, and we have a sort of octave that we're aware of, you know, but there are multiple other octaves, you know, parallel and similar, but imperceptible to us, but they could nevertheless sort of shade through our particular octave at any given time.
in metaphysical circles, you often hear the term raise your vibration.
Yeah.
And it seems to speak to that concept that
Mm.
we're very heavy, we're very low. And by raising that vibration, either via love or enlightenment or whatever we want to term it, we can almost literally ascend to those levels. And our species hasn't gotten there yet.
Yeah. I can dig that, as they say. You know, that whole sense that we're sort of spirits entangled in matter, as it were, and the entanglement getting worse and worse. Actually, you know, but your time here is to try and separate yourself from it to a certain extent. Well, as you absolutely do when you die, I guess you're separated from it at that point. But to try and separate it more successfully beforehand, perhaps, you know.
Where our spirits are driving these meat suits that we're in for X amount of time before we go to whatever is next. And there's a theory out there called Human 3.0, where the integration of technology into ourselves is slowing down, is retarding the evolution of spirit. It's pulling us farther away from spirit. And I've done research where they bring up the Greys, and that the Greys are disconnected from spirit. Let's talk about Greys for a second.
Sure. Yeah.
Abductions, lost time, crafts. So many of the reports that people give about ETs seem to fit the description of these beings. Do you what do you know about Greys?
I've never met one, but
that you know of.
Yeah, true. But there's, you know, the similarities in the sort of the look and size and so on of these beings that are encountered are strikingly similar. You know, I mean, I'm a big fan of John Mack, and you know, the research that he did into abduction scenarios. You know, he was a Harvard professor of psychology, I think. And during the course of his time at Harvard, he came across people who had had abduction experiences. And rather than writing it off as delusional, he started checking it out, you know, and wrote a book about it, and became like some of the sort of scientific type people who get involved in the subject. They start to realize that actually there's an incredible consistency about people's experiences. And so his research led him to sort of really accept that people who had abduction experiences, not everybody, but a great many, were telling the truth, essentially, you know. And I'm sure you know the great movie that was done by James Fox fairly recently called The Phenomenon. Have you come across that? Where
I'm aware of it.
It ends with the sighting at the Ariel School, and which is in South Africa. So it's a UFO sighting with beings, I think. I don't know whether they were exactly Greys, but could well have been. And it was a sighting witnessed by 30 or 40, if not more, children between the age of like maybe 6 and 7, 8, 9, 10, something like that, and their teachers, you know. And of course, it's incredibly compelling when you get children of that age talking about an experience that they've had. Their accounts all match up, you know. They're not sort of making it up, sort of thing. And John Mack did a lot of interviews with those children for precisely the reason, because he thought that they were the least likely people to be delusional, you know. Yeah, I got to see Bud Hopkins talk here in Canterbury as well. Bud Hopkins was a very kind of ubiquitous sort of researcher into the abduction phenomena. Like a lot of these people who you could argue possibly get close to the truth, he seemed to get fed some dodgy material at some point and got himself rather discredited and so on. But then, of course, if the subject is real and if the cover-up is real, then people who are kind of, as it were, getting an audience and so on are going to be discredited. That's fairly obvious, you know. So I think
that seem to be the way. There always seems to be something that is damning and never gets cleared from the record by someone who gets too close.
Well, you know, you have that sort of very obviously in, with people like Julian Assange and Russell Brand these days as well. It's kind of pretty clumsy, actually, sort of attempts to take them down with something that, especially in Russell Brand's case, I think doesn't really get a lot of, it's kind of, we don't need to go into all of that, but it's clearly an attempt to shut him up, or take him out of the
It's
public.
hard to know.
Yeah.
It's hard to know what to say anymore, because whether it's true or not, it's now out there. And those who are uninformed will go, oh, that guy, oh, he's a pedophile. He's a this, he's a that. That's the first thing that you'll think of when associated with their name. Yeah. So it's unfortunate.
But these days, I think with social media, there is this alternative ways of gathering information. And, so I think you don't feel quite as alone when you're kind of, as you're saying, you sort of smell a bit of a rat somehow, and you're thinking, oh, this isn't right, this isn't true, and everyone else is kind of like, going with the flow, as it were. These days, it's much easier to find your tribe, as it were, and which is great. I think, even if not all of it's right, it's still interesting that the variety, truly what one could call free speech, is available to so many more people than it used to be.
We are finding tribes, and I don't know how things have been in the UK over the past couple of years, but here there are so many people who feel disenfranchised, unheard, that they will take what is seen as the establishment and they will throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I don't want to believe in anything because everything is a lie. Yeah. And the things that are coming out now, I find more people subscribing to concepts like flat Earth, hollow Earth.
Yes.
And just saying this, now my phone heard me say this, I'm going to be getting flat Earth videos next week.
Absolutely, yeah.
But me being in the paranormal, being into ghosts and spirits, I'm used to people not being believed. And I have to make a conscious effort to say, well, I think you're crazy, but you know what? I'm going to listen to you. Make your case. Do you feel that listening to such seemingly crazy theories is helpful for the conversation? Or is it just, okay, now there's too much disinformation?
I was thinking about this when I was, thinking about this interview upcoming, and thinking about how this is a huge generalization, of course, but when I read the stuff on X, largely there, the way people talk about the UFO subject is as if it's kind of, well, it's either this or it's that. It's either real or it's not. They're either from here, or they're hyperdimensional, or they're under the oceans. And if it's none of those three, then it's all untrue. It's this kind of slightly sciencey kind of way of looking at it and wanting a rational answer, Whereas I was thinking about the Timothy Good books, which embrace the sort of absurdity of the UFO subject as well, in a way that perhaps English people are more used to doing. There's that sort of eccentric, slightly mad dogs and Englishmen type sense of, and it's still here. You embrace absurdity. We live in a country, with a king and all these sort of ridiculous, antiquated things. But people kind of like that. But it is absurd. And absurdity is a part of English life. I'm the Walrus and Lewis Carroll and Edward Lear and all this kind of stuff. So I sort of think that embracing, when you're dealing with paranormal things, the UFO subject, there is an element of what seems absurd, but you shouldn't rule it out because of absurdity. In a sense, it's almost, I think, a sort of glimmer of, no, that's probably the right direction, and some of the more kind of logical explanations tend to sort of not hold water in the end. And a sort of, logic can always be disproved in a sense. Science does have its absurdities, but yeah. So that's what a slightly abstruse kind of bit of reasoning. But yeah, I'm not necessarily put off by something sounding crazy.
Sometimes it comes down to just something as simple as rebranding. Just like psychical research underwent a rebranding to parapsychology to make it sound more academic. Now UFOs are UAPs.
Yes.
a rebranding of sorts to not only include underwater phenomenon, things that are not necessarily aerial,
Yeah.
but I think around here, I know government is using it as a look over here, look over here. We're going to talk about it now. Don't pay attention to this bill that we're going to pass. But look, we might
Yes.
have something.
Right.
How important do you feel disclosure is, and do you sense that there is a potential for more misinformation in its presentation?
I was very excited to watch the congressional hearing with David Grush and Ryan Graves.
We all were.
Braver, yeah. I sort of tuned into that here in the UK and watched the whole thing. It was, and I thought it was impressive. You know, even if everyone's on the wrong track and being conned and it's a psyop or whatever, you know, the downside, it's still fascinating. You know, and I think still adds to the sort of weight of the sense that there's, at the very least, we're not being told the truth about what's going on, and something is going on, you know. So that bare minimum thing is guaranteed, I think, you know. And I do think since 2017, you know, in the New York Times article by Leslie Keane and Ralph Blumenthal, isn't it? The sense that now the debate, as it were, is not so much about, you know, do UFOs, or let's call them UAPs, do they exist? It's kind of, yes, they exist. Now the question is, what are they? You know, and I think again that's a sort of that's a quite a huge step, actually. You know, certainly from where it was back in the 90s when I was first getting into it, when it was all about, well, people who believe that stuff are crazy, you know, and now that's not an acceptable kind of framework for talking about the subject, you know, as it's not on all sorts of subjects anymore. You know, it's you kind of have to give some respect to people who have, you know, experiences that define their way of looking at the world in a certain way, you know.
It used to be incendiary. I mean, look at the early 80s.
Yeah.
For us, Reagan was president. The first lady, Nancy Reagan, was famously, she used to consult psychics. I'm like, oh, that's strange. Oh, Ronald Reagan himself mentioned seeing something strange in the sky when he was aboard a Cessna aircraft, and he says it took off at insane velocities. And for a U.S. president, and he wasn't the first, Jimmy Carter reported a UFO sighting. It's not just restricted to the U.S. I know the Ministry of Defense once had a hotline for the public to report what they saw, and that was discontinued.
Yeah.
Do you think it's important for the general public to be involved, or should this just be leave it to the government, leave it to the professionals?
I think never leave it to the government. You know, no, I think it's important that people are involved. You know, I get that it's. I remember when, I think in the late 90s, after I'd been sort of reading the subject for a while, you know, and it was, you know, around the time of the X-Files, which I didn't actually watch that much. Actually, I watched a few episodes, but I was visiting a friend of mine in Pasadena at the time who lived opposite a guy who worked for JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratories, and he gave me a tour around the Jet Propulsion Laboratories, and I saw all the sort of stuff that they'd shot into space, and you know, so he was the opposite of the UFO mind. You know, I mean, he was kind of like nuts and bolts, you know, these sort of things that look like they were made of tin foil and balsa wood that had been into space and come back again, you know. And and I guess, you know, I had total respect for his point of view, you know, but I did have a bit of a, if you like, a Tom DeLonge moment where I suddenly got this, you know, Tom DeLonge famously said that when he was told some stuff, he didn't sleep for 3 nights, you know, which again, I reference in my song since 2017.
Right.
But I had this moment where when you really do take it on that we are not alone in the universe, and that quite possibly we're not alone with some very superior kind of other creatures. It's heavy, you know.
It seems people from all different areas of life are getting involved. You mentioned Tom DeLonge. Yourself, me, I'm just a civilian who's interested in the topic. That brings me back to Dr. Stephen Greer. and his CE5 protocols.
Yeah.
This being an effort that's saying we can contact them ourselves. You and I can conduct a CE5 protocol session and potentially connect with these beings. I like that, but at the same time, when I look around at some people, I'm like, ooh, I don't want them to be the representative for our species.
For sure.
What do you think about CE5 protocols?
Yeah, I mean, Stephen Greer is he's had a rough ride. I think, I do remember watching some of his stuff, and especially his disclosure project, back in whenever that was at the Washington Press Club. That was in the 2000s, wasn't it? And a lot of the people who stood up. So for people who don't know about it, he basically organized it's a large number, wasn't it? Maybe 200 people, but I sort of saw 20 or 30 people speaking, and they were pilots, they were military personnel, people who had nothing to gain really from talking about what they supposedly saw, and some incredibly compelling first witness testimony came from those sessions. I thought, watch the Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp stuff, I find them pretty compelling. They're almost like in a very different camp from Stephen Greer and his CE5 thing. So the UFO world has always been riven with these kind of sort of big egos and big disputes. And so
it's everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. That is the world, isn't it? Yeah. But when you talk about contacting CE5, it reminds me of it's sort of Gnosticism, really. Do you know what I mean? This idea that you can have your personal relationship with God. You don't need a priest to intercede for you or some preacher, who's the connection between you and God. You can do it yourself. And maybe that's a similar bit of human dilemma thinking, really, that you, why not sort of be able to have this direct relationship with NHI rather than relying on Tim Burchett to figure it all out for us.
It is very much a response to the let them eat cake reaction we've gotten from government agencies over these years. We're like, all right, now we are fed up with it and we're taking it into our own hands. Yeah. And you just mentioned George Knapp. Now, wasn't he involved with Skinwalker Ranch? I believe there was a couple of books that he consulted on.
All these guys out in Vegas, sort of...
when I read about before I read about it, I was very interested. I'm like, ooh, I want to go there. I want to get involved. I want to see this. And after reading the two books, I no longer want to go there. But it made me think. Again, it's called Skinwalker, which is a reference to a First Nation belief that a shaman or someone from the tribe went rogue, went dark, and has been cursed into this new form.
Right.
Now, if you're in the paranormal, if you're into ghosts and spirits, it's a Skinwalker. But maybe that Skinwalker to ufologists is a gray. Maybe to someone religious, it's a demon. We have lots of different names for what could be describing the same thing. And this is where I feel there's a lot of overlap. And it also shows we don't know as much as we think we do.
Yeah. I would agree with that. Yeah. And it sort of leads on to the notion of, disclosure. Do you really want to find out, that sort of thing, and also
do we know? Do we want to know?
Exactly. Do we? Is it really in our best interests? I tend to think yes, because I think it's exciting, but I get that it may well be opening up, a sort of Pandora's box. Well, it is opening up Pandora's box, as I say in the song. It's you're facing a whole different way of looking at. Reality is the only word, isn't it? Right now, reality is kind of dealable with. It's horrendous in many ways, but day to day, it's kind of okay. But if you've got to deal with the world that you enter into in your sort of paranormal explorations as a sort of part of your everyday life, then I imagine that's going to be pretty heavy,
I constantly come back to this quote from Men in Black when Tommy Lee Jones is trying to recruit Will Smith, and he goes, we once knew that we were the center of the universe. We once knew that we orbit the sun, and he's going through all these things. He's like, imagine what you'll know tomorrow.
I remember watching that with my kids when it came out, and I sort of saying to them, wow, this is a documentary. You know, this is so much in it that's like kind of alluded to in the literature. It's a very clever film, I think, you know. But this idea that Earth is sort of like, as it were, you know, a kind of place that there's like thousands of different races all kind of hanging out here, and some of them are really pretty stupid and kind of some of them are really pretty, you know, like, you know, not good intentions, and some are trying to help, and you know that it's quite chaotic. And again, I go back to that idea of the absurdity, you know, that is, you couldn't even begin to figure it out even if you started to know much more about the subject. You know, it would just go on and on forever, you know.
It did make me look at the Battery Tunnel entrance building a lot different when I would pass. I'd go, "Oh, that's the spaceport."
Yeah.
There's a couple of in my research. There's a couple of books that really affected me, and almost like Men in Black, I would come across them, and then I would spend days going. Almost the Tom DeLonge 3 days didn't sleep. One of them was called Abduction to the Ninth Planet.
Okay.
Or it was retitled, I think, The Thiuber Prophecy. Have you ever come across that?
Not read that, no.
It was written by Michel Demarquet. And it was about a Frenchman he was just a farmer. He was allegedly abducted and taken to this place where they were instructed to show him kind of how things work. And I mentioned before the cosmic law of one. And in this book, it said, okay, you have to read this 3 times for full saturation. And I've read it twice.
Okay.
Every time I read it, I pick up different things. And it mentions things like Atlantis, Lemuria, how the asteroid that supposedly wiped out the dinosaurs was something different, this cosmic war. And again, this is one of those tomes that I was amazed by, but there were certain parts of it that felt, I'll have to send you a PDF
Please.
of it. It's
No,
it's
I'll
quite
buy it.
a read.
Yeah.
But all of these tomes, I feel, have historical linchpins. Like they'll talk about Jesus, they'll talk about the dinosaurs, they will talk about the Great Flood, and there's a commonality between that. Have you noticed this in your research?
Well, we were talking earlier, I think you were talking about Eric Van Deniken's Chariots of the Gods. And
yes.
But I think one of the books that did stop me in my tracks was Graham Hancock's book, Fingerprints of the Gods. And,
Fingerprints, yes.
Yeah, and in that book, in the first sort of chapter, he talks about the I think it's called the Piri Reis map. So that it's you know, this is a map that's might even be in the British Museum, but it's an extant map that shows the continent of Antarctica before the ice formed on it. His whole book is predicated on this idea that there was some sort of catastrophic flood event around about, I think he puts it around about 10,000 BC, 11,000 BC. He talks a lot about, you know, the rainwater weathering on the Sphinx, and in meaning that the Sphinx is maybe a lot older than it's said to be. I think in the early days he thought that the pyramids were a lot older than they're suggested to be. I think the current dating is like 2,500 BC. He thinks they're much older, but I think these days he's kind of dropped that and he sort of accepts that maybe they were built then. But then again, you know, the pyramids are another, to me, massive question mark about human beings and what they're capable of, or maybe human beings interacting with some other intelligence in order to create this incredibly mysterious structure, and a structure that we couldn't engineer today, you know. And so yeah, I think, you know, everywhere you look, once you're starting to be curious, as it were, and ask they're not even difficult questions, they're pretty simple questions, you know, you start to realize that we don't really have any answers to a lot of stuff. You know?
Well, from the 40s to now, there's like I mentioned before, pop culture has informed us of a change, because back then it was tin flying saucers with little green men, and that's what aliens were. And where'd they come from? Mars.
Yeah.
Now we have so many different options available to us. And I want
Yeah.
to rewind for a second because you mentioned the flood and then catastrophe. I came across a document called The Story of Adam and Eve that has been sanitized by the CIA, but
Yeah.
it mentions how poles may shift. There will be a geomagnetic shifting of poles. And when this happens every, say, 5,000-6,000 years, it creates such disasters on our planet that pretty much wipes the slate clean for these ancient civilizations. That might be what happened to Atlantis. That might be the story, the inspiration for the story of the Garden of Eden. It's like, well, they had to leave because society was wiped out.
Yeah. I think that's an idea that comes up in the Graham Hancock book, Fingerprints of the Gods, this, what do they call it, Earth crust displacement, I think, this idea of the crust of the Earth sort of floating on the surface, and sometimes it shifts kind of like quite radically, which is slightly different from the magnetic thing. But again, there's, scientific evidence that they've discovered, like it sounds ridiculous, but a woolly mammoth or something, some kind of animal that was around in that sort of 10,000 BC kind of time, that frozen in the ice kind of thing, but its stomach is full of undigested grass, as if it was basically flash frozen. Now, I mean, I don't know all this about how scientifically, as it were, verifiable this sort of stuff is, but it seems to come from, not at all paranormal sort of stuff. It's people who find evidence that's completely anomalous. And this, so this stuff is out there. Again, I think the fall. I guess, the illusion that we live in this very stable world, the geological record will seem to suggest that it's anything but stable,
Right. It does come down to scales. I mean, it makes me think of the Fermi paradox. If there's so much life in the universe, where is everybody?
Yes.
And where is everybody? And that introduces the dark forest theory. That says, okay, well, yeah, they're out there, but they don't want to make themselves known because they're hiding from predators. And that kind of makes sense. I understand that as a tangent regarding the pyramids and all these other structures that just could not have been built, that couldn't have worked. I remember a quote from Gene Roddenberry, of all people, who said, that doesn't make sense. Like, man is smart. Man figured it out. We can do this. Like, we should take more pride in that. Yes, we did this. It was hard, but we accomplished it, and not have everything, the credit be given to a god, an alien, something that was beyond us. And I flip flop between it's got to be aliens and no, we did this. We're capable.
Yeah.
Do you think we're ready to join?
Good question, isn't it? I don't know is the answer to that. Sometimes you read, when you're talking about disclosure, that it's really not up to us. It's up to the aliens, for want of a better word for them. That they're sort of running the show, really, and it's because they could disclose themselves, and that's really the only thing I think that would allow human beings to believe. If they showed up, and it wasn't the government kind of making an announcement, because if the government makes an announcement, then nobody's going to believe them, and even if they've got sort of, video footage or whatever it is, it's like CGI, it's AI, it's whatever. Do you know what I mean? So you do need a sort of Independence Day scenario almost, where the things are above all the major cities, and then people have. Well, then that's it. The fact that that's not happening would seem to suggest, because some people sort of are in the space of like, you're never going to know about it, and they're never going to be open about it. And I think that's probably true, actually.
And somewhere at the center of our galaxy is a galactic senate of all these races, and they're like, okay, today on the docket, do we let Earth into our brotherhood? And they're like, no, we are we're the third world galaxy that they don't want us to let us in.
Absolutely.
It's
It's
gonna
like
be
we've
bad.
got it all sorted out here. Just let them get on with it on Earth. Yeah.
So on a more
Mm,
personal level,
mm,
okay, a craft lands in your backyard, and they
mm,
say, Jack, come on, we're going to go on a trip.
mm,
And that trip might be beyond the lifetime that you could come back to
mm,
Earth. Would you go just to
mm.
find out, to know?
What a great
Would you go with
question.
them?
Yeah, I think I probably would. Actually, I would be fascinated to know. Yeah. Mm,
You cannot leave this planet until those early tracks are remastered and
exactly.
released. They've
Yeah.
been
I'm
promising for
sure they would say that.
years.
Can you give us a call when you finally got that Wang Chung retrospective out?
There you go. That's what I've been waiting for.
Yeah.
That's what I've been hoping for.
Mm, yeah.
I mean, all right. Speaking of Wang Chung, I mean, we've got
Mm,
tracks. We mentioned Akasha.
yeah.
Space Junk obviously is a popular one. Through the
Mhm,
10th Dimension to the Certainties Beyond.
mhm,
You mentioned the machine that spins within me and the spirit that drives me on. Like these
mhm.
are all they resonate with me on a paranormal level, and they're
Yeah. Yeah.
very
Mm,
spiritually aware.
mm,
And now we get back to since 2017.
yeah.
We've mentioned some of the references that
Yeah.
have come out. Where is our species headed? Where
Mm,
are we going? And again, it brings me back to those grays. I'm sure you've heard of the theory that those aliens are human related. They are evolutionary
yeah.
descendants of ours that have come back.
Yeah. We share
Um,
DNA with them, so supposedly, but yeah.
it scares me because I think, well, if they're coming back, if they're disconnected from spirit,
Yeah.
and they're taking us trying to find a way to maybe get it back,
Yeah.
does this mean we are on the wrong path? Like we're going to end up
Mm,
like them? What do you think
mhm.
about that?
There's some pretty dark stuff about, spirit, us being, I think it's Bob Lazar, isn't it, who said they refer to us as containers. And
Mm.
this idea that we're kind of human bodies, but we contain spirit, and that's what they're after, and that it's kind of like abduction is about trying to sort of interfere with that in some way. I don't know. This is sort of more your territory in a sense, because I was going to ask you, about your investigations into the paranormal and into the sort of spiritual realm. Do your investigations sort of convince you that there's a reality to it, the stuff that you're looking at that's consistent, or does it make you feel less convinced, if you know what I mean by that?
My involvement in the paranormal
Mm,
has convinced me, but it took me a long time.
mm,
Now, when I first started dabbling in this, I was a
yeah.
skeptic,
Uh-huh.
complete and utter skeptic. I didn't believe in any of it,
Mm,
and I had gotten to that point. It was about college, the college years,
yeah.
where you go to school, you think you know everything,
Mhm,
and I'm convinced if I haven't seen it, it doesn't exist.
yeah.
But I wasn't always that way. When I was a child, well, I was raised Catholic,
Hmm.
and I watched shows like In Search of. I ate this stuff up,
Hmm.
and yes, you believe. When
Hmm.
you're a child, you have no reason not to believe.
Sure.
So this change from innocent child to skeptical young adult,
Mm,
when I started my journey, I was starting from zero. Oh, not even zero, negative numbers.
mhm,
Every experience I had, every book I read, every little bit that I digested was like a little grain of sand.
mhm,
And individually, it wasn't convincing. Like, hey, Jack, here, check this out.
mm.
Oh, yeah, that's nothing. Boom. But
Straight up the UFO
over
stuff.
time,
Yeah.
I looked down, and metaphorically speaking, all those grains of sand that I had collected formed a beach that I was standing on.
Yeah.
And I had to wrestle with what that meant.
Mm,
So it brought me back. I'm not religious per se, but I could say I'm spiritual now. Yeah, there's something. I don't know what it is. I'm
yeah.
still looking into it, but I
Mhm,
feel I've experienced enough to say, yeah,
mhm.
there's something. And only recently has this bled over into the other areas
Right.
of the paranormal, like ufology. Thinking about it, I remember being out on the Extraterrestrial Highway out in Nevada, and I got to the black mailbox, and this thing's in the middle of nowhere. this can't just be out here by itself. I'm being monitored, I'm being watched, but who's watching me? I don't know if they received their mail there or whatever it is. It's just one of those places that you visit.
Yeah.
And I felt the eyes on me. I felt the surveillance.
I was in Vegas for we did a show. Wang Chung did a show there. This will be back in 2012, something like that. And we had a few days off after it, you know. So I said to Tom, the drummer at the time, fancy coming up to Area 51 with me? Do you know what I mean? He's a complete skeptic. Do you know what I mean? Like, sort of just finds my interest in UFOs so funny, you know. And then Paul, the keyboard player, Tom was going, like, you come as well. Let's the three of us go. I think Nick he booked like a helicopter ride or something with his brother or something. So he was like sort of doing something else. So I rented a car and we sort of drove up to the little alien, basically. You know, that's where we were headed first. And we went in there, sort of had a coffee and got chatting to the two ladies that run that place. It's mother and daughter, I think, you know. And so I was sort of saying to her, you know, so where's this mailbox, you know, and what do we do when we get there, you know, sort of like, you know. And she said, don't you come, you know, mentioning my name if you get arrested and stuff. I didn't tell you any of this stuff. But she sort of gave us the directions, basically. So we drove back down the whatever that road is, you know, and yeah, saw the black mailbox. Just seeing that, having read about it all in so many of the books and the magazines that I'd read, you know. So that was a thrill. And then I said, well, shall we try and, you know, she said, you know, you sort of go and then do a right and then you'll get there. So we basically did that and got up, just like you, got up to the fence sort of thing, you know. So we were sort of off-road and the gate was open, I think, you know, but it sort of said, you know, you do not progress beyond this point. And I thought, well, I wonder, presumably you go round the corner and then there's a proper sort of gate with guys who tell you to turn around and stuff, you know. Right. But we were followed by those sort of 4x4 sort of things, that private security firm that patrols that area. They weren't like right on our tail, but you could see them sort of like shadowing us, basically, you know. So I didn't have quite the same sense of like, I'm being surveilled that you did. The car.
And imagine though, yeah, that is a decoy. We're so focused with Area 51, it's got to be there. But meanwhile, maybe 2 miles down the road is Area 52, and yes, that's exactly where it's all happening.
Yeah.
Thinking about Area 51 and just everything we've been talking about, one of the lines that again keeps sticking out from since 2017 is they've come to take the matches from the child.
Oh yeah.
And there have been so many indications that the rapid release of technology in our society is from reverse engineered alien technology. And I'm thinking, where are we headed, and how much of it is us and how much of it is them?
It's there's that book, isn't there, The Day After Roswell, I think, which I've not read, but I've read, you know, listened to people talk about it. You know, Philip Corso talks about, you know, sort of microchip technology basically being sort of something they got out of Roswell, or, you know, it's really hard to know with that stuff. You know, I sort of feel that what we've got is not so outlandish. Right now, it still all seems like, well, it's all still in the same kind of realm. You know, sometimes I think, especially maybe living in England, in Canterbury, you know, which is an old medieval city, I think we haven't really moved on that much. Do you know what I mean? We've got electricity and, you know, hot water comes out the taps and stuff, you know, but again, it's all pretty basic fossil fuel stuff, you know. You know, the past is so present with you in a place like Canterbury, you know. Yeah.
So you'll be okay when all the internet goes down. You guys will be fine. I'm coming there.
I've got my vinyl. I got all my books here, you know, and you know, I can still access information, albeit about the past. You know. Yeah.
So I've recently been introduced to the Quartet and your solo work, and I'm digesting it at a rapid pace. I've always been a fan. This I only was introduced to less than a decade ago. Love it. I'm a huge Genesis fan, so I'm constantly being inspired, and it's soundtrack of my life. So thank you for that. Where do you see yourself going musically in the next few years?
That's a good question. I've been working on another solo album. I did Primitive back in 2020, and then during the pandemic year, I had these sort of bits of songs, very diverse, different sorts of songs. So I sort of got those all together and put out a second album. And the third album is a more considered set of songs, of which since 2017 will be one of the tracks from that, or actually two of the tracks, because it's really two songs in one. Since 2017, and They've Come to Take the Matches from the Child is a sort of separate track, really, which I need to develop a little more. I still love it. I'm going to be doing some more touring with Wang Chung this summer. Quite a lot of gigs planned in the States, and so looking forward to that. The project to release all of the Wang Chung back catalogue is ongoing. We're very close now to releasing the first kind of, it's like a sort of sampler, as it were, including the hits and some stuff that's never been released before on a sort of double album is what we're trying to put out. So we're pretty well up the road with that. So hopefully that's going to happen all this year.
So count me in. Any of that material that comes out, I am in. I've been waiting for a remaster. Drive Me Crazy, Hard Times. Cool. Is it about time we were on TV?
Yeah, all that stuff is going to be done. Yeah. No, totally.
Well, Jack, we're gonna wrap this up, because I could talk to you all day, and
it's been a real pleasure.
We've got things.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We'll have to do this again, and I think we should plan a ufology adventure somewhere, be it on your turf, on mine. There's things to be discovered, and the truth is out there.
It would be really great to do that with you, Brian. Great.
So let's stay in touch. Thank you again. This has been an honor and a pleasure. And as I tell everyone that's on my Patreon, and my motto has always been never stop searching.
Yes.
And yours would be everybody, Wang Chung tonight.
I'm stuck with that one. Yeah. Thanks, Brian. It's been a real pleasure.